It began as a quiet, misty dawn on April 22nd, 2016, in the rural stillness of Pike County, Ohio, a place where everyone knew one another, where secrets didn't last long, and where family was everything. But that morning, silence carried a different weight. It wasn't the peaceful calm of country life. It was the eerie stillness that precedes discovery. By sunrise, 8 lives would be stolen, for homes would become crime scenes, and one of the most haunting mass murders in Ohio's history would unravel, a massacre so methodical, so cold, that investigators at first believed it had to be the work of professionals. The first call came from a panicked voice, one of the Rhoden family's relatives who had gone to check on them after not hearing back all night. What they found would never leave their minds. Inside a modest trailer, nestled among trees and gravel roads, lay the lifeless bodies of family members, each executed with precision. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, just the unmistakable, chilling mark of intent. As word spread, more homes were checked. Another house, another horror, then another. By the time law enforcement realized what was happening, 8 members of the same family were dead, each murdered as they slept or sat unaware of their fate. 3 young children were found alive amid the carnage, tiny survivors who, by some miracle or mercy, were spared the slaughter that had wiped out nearly an entire generation of their family. The victims were not strangers to each other. They were blood, bound by love and the routines of small-town life. There was Christopher Rhoden Sr., the hard-working patriarch and family anchor, known for his tough exterior and gentle heart. His son, Frankie Rhoden, a young father devoted to his kids, always smiling and full of jokes. Frankie's fiancée, Hannah Mae Rhoden, was just 19, a teenage mother who loved her baby fiercely and dreamed of a better future. Then there was Dana Rhoden, Christopher's ex-wife, but still a close friend, nurturing, soft-spoken, always putting family first. Their children and relatives, Chris Jr., Clarence Frankie Rhoden, Gary Rhoden, and Hannah Gilly, filled out the picture of a tight-knit family. They worked, laughed, argued, and celebrated together. They weren't wealthy or powerful. They lived simply, surrounded by rolling fields and gravel backroads. But in the early hours of that April morning, something or someone decided their lives no longer mattered. The discovery left Pike County in disbelief, in a community where neighbors left doors unlocked, where people waved from passing trucks. The word massacre felt foreign, unthinkable. For days, residents locked themselves indoors, afraid that a killer still roamed the hills. Rumors spiraled. Was it drug-related? A cartel hit? A revenge killing? The brutality seemed too precise for anything else. Yet, as investigators began their grim work, processing for different crime scenes, collecting shell casings, swabs, and cell phones, they noticed patterns. The victims had been targeted. Nothing was random. Each scene told a piece of the same dark story, a plan carried out with patience, familiarity, and emotional knowledge of those who died. The Rhoden's killers hadn't just walked in. They had known exactly where to go, who to shoot first, who might fight back, and which children to spare. It wasn't rage. It was design. And in that terrifying realization, one truth became clear to detectives. The people who murdered the Rhodens were not strangers. They were close enough to know every intimate detail of the family's lives, close enough to slip through their doors without fear, close enough to betray them in the most unimaginable way. In the coming months, what began as whispers of suspicion would lead to one of the most complex, shocking, and twisted family betrayals in modern American crime, a story of obsession, control, and a fight over a child that would end in 8 deaths. The Rhodens were gone, but their story had only begun. In the days that followed, as investigators combed through their homes, the quiet roads of Piketon became lined with police cruisers, news vans, and neighbors clutching each other in disbelief. But amid the chaos, something deeper began to take shape, the story of who these people were before their names became headlines. Christopher Rhoden Sr., often called Chris, was a family's foundation, a man who could fix just about anything, from a broken truck to a broken heart. His friends described him as loyal and tough, someone who believed in protecting his own. Chris Sr. lived for his family. He worked long hours, balancing his time between jobs and helping his children with whatever they needed. To his neighbors, he was dependable. To his family, He was the glue that held them all together. His ex-wife, Dana Rhoden, shared that same devotion. Though she and Chris Sr. had separated, their connection never really broke. She was a mother first and foremost, the kind of woman who texted her kids constantly, reminding them to lock their doors and drive safe. She worked as a nurse's aide, caring for others even as she raised her own family through hardship. Her colleagues remembered her laughter, her compassion, and her strength, traits that would echo in the children she left behind. Their son, Frankie Rhoden, was the kind of young man everyone liked to be around. In his early 20s, he was vibrant, full of energy, and utterly devoted to his kids. Friends said he was the sort who'd do anything for the people he loved, always joking, always smiling. His fiancée, Hannah Gilley, was just 20, soft-spoken and kind. Together, they were building a life, one filled with plans for their future, their children, and dreams that would never be realized. Chris Rhoden, Jr., barely a man himself, was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. He loved working with his hands, fixing cars, hunting, and helping family. His potential was limitless, but like the rest, his story ended far too soon. And then there was Hannah Mae Rhoden, the 19-year-old mother at the center of what would later become the heart of this tragedy. She was young, sweet, and full of life, a girl caught between growing up and raising a baby. Her friends said she loved her daughter more than anything. Every photo of her radiated the light of a new mother's joy. She wanted to build a safe, happy world for her child, free from conflict and fear. But what she didn't know was that her hope for peace would put her family directly in the crosshairs of destruction. Her baby at the time of the murders was found unharmed beside her mother's body. The image haunted investigators. A mother dead, her child crying softly in the dark, too young to understand what had been taken. The other victims, Gary Rhoden, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, and other relatives, shared the same bloodline and bond. Each had a story, a reason to live, and people who loved them deeply. The Rhodens weren't perfect. No family is. But their lives were woven together by the familiar threads of small-town America. Family loyalty, struggle, pride, and the belief that love could carry them through anything. When the funerals began, the Pike County community came to a halt. 8 caskets, 8 lives extinguished. Churches overflowed. Schools held moments of silence. Strangers wept beside neighbors. It wasn't just the scale of the tragedy that stunned people. It was the intimacy of it, the sheer cruelty of killing a family in their own beds. As the days turned to weeks, the grief gave way to suspicion. Investigators searched tirelessly for answers, but nothing about the case made sense. Whoever had done this had moved with calm and purpose. Behind the scenes, detectives began to trace threads that led them not outsiders, but to people the Rhoden once called friends. Families who shared meals, holidays, and memories. Among those names, one family quietly stood out, the Wagners. They had been close to the Rhodens for years. Their sons had dated the Rhoden girls. Their children played together. They shared the same dirt roads, the same stores, the same small-town smiles. To most, the Wagners were a normal, loving family. Maybe a little private, maybe a little different, but decent people nonetheless. But as investigators would later uncover, beneath that image of normalcy lay something else entirely, a world of control, manipulation, and paranoia. A family obsessed with keeping power over their own, no matter the cost. But why did the Wagners kill the Rhodens? A custody dispute. It sounds almost unbelievable. How could a disagreement over a child lead to such cold-blooded slaughter? But in the minds of the Wagners, twisted by control, paranoia, and obsession, it made sense. To them, it wasn't murder, it was protection. Jake Wagner, the youngest son in the Wagner family, had a daughter with Hannah Rhoden, one of the victims. After their breakup, Hannah began to move on with her life. She was young, vibrant, and caring, a devoted mother who wanted her daughter to grow up surrounded by love, not control. She wanted freedom. But to Jake and his mother, Angela Wagner, that freedom was a threat. The Wagners were a family consumed by fear and mistrust. They believed the world outside their circle was corrupt, dangerous, and deceitful. Angela, the matriarch, ruled with manipulation and emotional control, convincing her husband and sons that no one could be trusted, not even the mother of Jake's child. When Hannah Rhoden refused to sign over custody and began a new relationship, the Wagners grew more desperate. Angela and Jake began obsessing over messages, social media posts, and conversations, interpreting every move Hannah made as an attempt to take their daughter away. When the Wagner family was finally unmasked in 2018, the truth did not come in a single revelation. It arrived in fragments, built piece by painstaking piece through 2 years of relentless investigation. For detectives, it was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle made of grief, lies, and fear. But how were they unmasked? In the earliest days after the massacre, law enforcement had been confronted with chaos. For separate crime scenes stretched across rural Pike County, each one soaked in the silence of slaughter. The bodies had been found by horrified relatives, family members stumbling upon their loved ones in the most gruesome of conditions. The investigators from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, aided by the FBI and local deputies, knew immediately that this was no ordinary murder case. For months, they faced walls of confusion. Tips poured in from across the country, each one leading nowhere. Theories multiplied: drug cartel involvement, motorcycle gangs, revenge between rival families. But none of them fit. There was no evidence of drugs, no signs of a larger criminal network. What they did find, though, were whispers of tension between the Rhodens and the Wagners, whispers that grew louder as detectives dug deeper. Search warrants were executed quietly. Computers, phones, and social media accounts were seized. Investigators began to notice something strange in the digital trails: deleted messages between Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden, cryptic emails, and missing data. The Wagners had begun scrubbing their digital lives clean shortly after the murders, a detail that raised eyebrows but wasn't enough for arrest. Then came the physical evidence: traces of homemade silencers found on Wagner property, the purchase history of ammunition and firearm parts, notes about forged custody documents, signed, printed, and prepared before the murders ever occurred. But perhaps the most telling clue came from the smallest of details: a shoe print, found at one of the crime scenes. It matched the type of footwear sold at only a few stores in the region. Investigators traced it back to a purchase connected to one of the Wagners. It was the first tangible crack in the wall of secrecy that family had built around themselves. Meanwhile, the Wagners moved as if nothing was wrong. They relocated to Alaska, hoping to outrun the storm that was quietly forming behind them. They lived under the radar, far from Ohio, convinced they had covered their tracks. But their attempts to hide only drew more attention. Law enforcement followed them, collecting receipts, surveillance footage, and documents that painted a clearer picture of their movements before and after the killings. By 2018, Ohio's Attorney General and Pike County Sheriff's Office had gathered enough evidence to move forward. The day the arrests were made, November 13th, 2018, was one the community would never forget. In coordinated raids, law enforcement descended upon multiple locations in Ohio and Alaska. One by one, the Wagners were taken into custody. As the news spread, a stunned silence fell over Pike County. The unthinkable had been confirmed. The killers had been people they knew, people who attended the funerals, shaken hands, and expressed condolences. Neighbors remembered how Angela Wagner had publicly grieved for Hannah and how Jake had spoken about missing her. It was all a lie. The arrest brought relief, but the road to justice would be long. The legal process was complex. For defendants, each facing 8 counts of aggravated murder, along with charges of conspiracy, tamper with evidence, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty. But the Wagners were not united in silence for long. The first crack in their defense came from within. Edward Jake Wagner, the youngest son and the one most directly linked to the motive, began to waver. In 2021, after years of legal maneuvering, Jake stood before a judge and admitted what everyone had feared but long suspected. He had been there. He had pulled the trigger. He confessed to 5 of the 8 murders, describing in grim detail how the plan had been executed and how his family had worked together to ensure no witnesses survived. His confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom. In exchange for his cooperation and his testimony against his family, Jake avoided the death penalty. He agreed to spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. His words cracked open the fortress of denial his family had built, exposing the inner machinery of the conspiracy. Not long after, Angela Wagner, the matriarch, followed. She pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including conspiracy and aggravated burglary. Her demeanor in court was cold, detached, more like someone admitting to a business transaction than a mother acknowledging her role in the slaughter of another family. Her plea deal was strategic. She, too, would escape execution by assisting prosecutors. The two remaining defendants, George Wagner IV and Billy Wagner III, chose to fight. George IV, the quiet, stoic son who had long lived in his father's shadow, faced trial in 2022. Over the course of weeks, the courtroom became a gallery of horror. Jurors listened to testimony about the family's obsession with control, the months of preparation, and the cold execution of 8 people. Jake's testimony against his brother was damning. He described how George had helped plan and carry out the killings, providing weapons and backup as the murders unfolded. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. George Wagner was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 8 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 121 additional years for related crimes. As he was led away, his face showed no emotion. That left only Billy Wagner, the father, the man prosecutors described as the driving force behind the plan, the one who believed himself untouchable. His trial, long delayed by motions, transfers, and appeals, still looms as the final chapter of this tragedy. For the Rhoden family's surviving relatives, justice has been both a relief and a torment. They have sat through years of hearings, testimony, and grisly details. Each confession reopens wounds that never had the chance to heal. Yet through it all, they have remained steadfast, determined that the names of their loved ones would not fade into the shadow of the Wagner's crimes. The investigation that began with 4 blood-soaked trailers have revealed something even darker than anyone imagined. A family willing to destroy another, not for greed or revenge, but for control. And in doing so, the Wagners destroyed themselves. In the end, the quiet hills of Pike County had seen their justice. But peace, that would take much longer. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the last verdict was read, Pike County did not erupt in celebration. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory. Instead, there was silence, the kind that lingers when justice feels like too little, too late. For the surviving members of the Rhoden family, and for the community that watched the horror unfold over nearly a decade, there was no true closure, only the ache of what could never be restored. 8 lives were gone, 8 chairs forever empty, birthdays passed without laughter, holidays without the warmth of gathering. For the Rhoden's relatives, the pain was a constant companion. Many of them had discovered the crime scenes themselves. They had carried those images in their minds ever since. The funerals had been an ocean of grief, caskets lined in a row, each one representing a story cut short. Mothers buried their children. Children grew up without parents. The youngest survivors, the children spared that night, became symbols of both heartbreak and hope. Too young to remember the violence, they would one day learn of the horror that shaped their lives. They were reminders of innocence that refused to die, even when everything around it had been stained by betrayal. Guardians stepped in to raise them, protecting them from the glare of the media and the burden of their family's history. But in the quiet corners of Pike County, whispers persisted. Every face carried the memory of that night. Every road told part of the story. As time passed, investigators and prosecutors reflected on the toll the case had taken. It had become one of the largest, most expensive criminal investigations in Ohio's history. Thousands of pieces of evidence, dozens of search warrants, and endless interviews had finally unearthed the truth. But it came at a price. Years of anguish, sleepless nights, and the haunting knowledge that evil had worn the face of familiarity. For the community, the massacre became more than a local tragedy. It was a symbol of how darkness can take root in ordinary soil. Pike County had always been a quiet, unassuming place, a patchwork of farms and forests, where people measured life in seasons rather than headlines. But now, its name was forever linked to horror. Reporters called it the Pike County Massacre. To those who lived there, it was simply the day the world ended. Even after the convictions, questions lingered, unanswered, unsettling, impossible to silence. What truly went through the minds of the Wagners as they plotted those murders? Did none of them hesitate? Did no one feel the weight of what they were about to do? How could an entire family agree to wipe out another, to turn the act of murder into a twisted mission of loyalty? Psychologists and criminologists later studied the case, calling it a chilling example of family fusion, a psychological phenomenon where individuals lose their personal identity within a dominant family system. The Wagners operated not as four separate people, but as one mind, one entity driven by paranoia, control, and a belief that their actions were justified. In their warped moral code, killing was not evil, it was protection. Angela Wagner's manipulation was described as almost cult-like. She ruled with emotional blackmail and guilt, convincing her sons that the world outside their family was dangerous. Jake, in turn, became her weapon, a young man desperate for approval, molded into the instrument of her will. George IV, quieter and less assertive, followed along, perhaps too afraid to defy the family's hierarchy. And Billy, the father, was the enforcer, the one who reinforced the family's delusion that what they were doing was right. Together, they built a fortress of lies that would ultimately consume them. For the families of the victims, no psychological explanation could erase the pain. In interviews and court statements, they spoke not of revenge, but of loss of trust, loss of faith, loss of peace. They described sleepless nights, vivid nightmares, and the heavy silence that filled their homes. They spoke of birthdays that came and went without the laughter of the ones they loved, and of how even the sound of a gunshot on television could bring the past crashing back. The community, too, struggled to move on. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time. People who once waved at strangers now watched with suspicion. Pike County's soul had changed. Churches held vigils every April, lighting candles for the Rhodens, praying for healing, and hoping the land could forget the blood it had absorbed. But the scars went deeper than geography. They reached into the psyche of everyone touched by the case. Journalists who had covered the story from the beginning described a sense of dread that never faded, even after the trials. Investigators, hardened by years of crime scenes, admitted that this case haunted them in ways others hadn't. One officer described it simply: "You can't unsee it. You can't unfeel it." Even now, years after the killings, the story of the Rhodens and the Wagners continues to echo. The final piece of justice, Billy Wagner's trial, remains the last shadow over the case. Families wait for the day they can finally say every murderer has been held accountable. Yet deep down, they know true justice is impossible. You cannot restore what was destroyed. You can only live with the silence it left behind. The tragedy also forced broader questions about human nature. How far can obsession drive someone? How tightly can love twist before it becomes possession? And how do ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, even relatives, fail to see the monsters being built beside them? Some residents of Pike County say they no longer recognize their town. The fields are the same, the roads unchanged, but the spirit is different, quieter, more cautious. Others speak of resilience, of a community that refuses to let evil define it. Every year, they gather to remember the victims, not as headlines or statistics, but as people: Christopher, Dana, Frankie, Hannah, Gary, Chris Jr., Clarence, and Hannah Gilly. Names that once belonged to laughter, not tragedy. Their story serves as both warning and memorial, a testament to how darkness can disguise itself as love, and how betrayal can live under the same roof as trust. And so, as the years pass and the memory of that April night begins to fade from national headlines, the people of Pike County keep the memory alive. They speak their names, not to relive the horror, but to ensure it's never repeated. Because behind every true crime, beyond the courtroom and the cameras, lie the fragile remnants of real lives. People who loved, dreamed, and believed the world was safe. But the Pike County Massacre shattered that illusion forever. Even now, as justice stands on paper, the air in those Ohio hills still carries the echo of a single, haunting question, one that may never be answered. How does love turn into something so monstrous? As we close this haunting chapter of the Pike County Massacre, one truth remains impossible to ignore. Evil doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it lives beside us. It smiles at family dinners, shares our secrets, and hides behind a mask of love. 8 lives were lost, 8 families shattered, and though justice has spoken, peace is still a distant dream for those left behind. The story of the Rhoden family is a chilling reminder that behind every smiling face, every small-town fence, there can exist secrets so dark they defy reason. What do you think led to this tragedy? Was it manipulation, control, fear, or something far more sinister buried deep within human nature? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might help others see this case from a new light. If this story moved you, if you believe the victims deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and help keep their memory alive. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the world of true crime, where every case tells a story and every story reminds us how fragile trust can be. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look like family.